Thank you for joining the Once Changing the World, India's first future tech meets sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. James Arrowood, who's the co-CEO at Alcor Life Foundation, a world leader in cryonics, cryonics research, and cryonics technology. And the topic of discussion today is going to be cryonics and Alcor's work in fronting the cryonic industry. So James, really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast. Why don't we start with a small, brief introduction, your background, and it will be great if you can set context to the audience and explain what is cryonics.
In simplest terms, cryonics is using ultra cold temperature to stabilize kind of biological tissue to a degree where it doesn't continue to decay or suffer injury. And with the ultimate goal of reviving that tissue up to and including organs or entire persons. But really, ultimately, the first step would be to do an organ, like say a kidney. So organ banking for transplantation. Right now, there's a huge shortage of organs in the world and people can't get them. And it's purely a function of time, of viability of those cells. So if we can use ultra cold temperatures, which we know in for instance, the food context, you can put a piece of meat in the freezer and take it out and it's still edible. Well, theoretically, scientifically, the same ought to be true in terms of the viability of an organ in the body, up to and including the whole body. But it's a question of really doing the research and the science that's required to put it into a much larger thing than, say, just a little cell. We know, for instance, like embryos, IVF, where women get an embryo implanted that's been frozen at liquid nitrogen temperatures. It's more correctly stated as vitrified. That grows and becomes a human being that's living. So the proof of concept is already there. Like, this is something that already occurs. And there's people walking around that are born from the same processes that we're trying to apply to organs. And people say, well, why not just do what you do for embryos for organs? And the reason is because once you start getting into multicellular organs, an embryo is fairly simple. But as you start to layer and stack more and more biological components, it becomes increasingly complex. Doesn't mean we can't get there, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying aggressively. It just means it's scientifically more difficult, but not impossible. So that's the ultimate goal, is to preserve organs and up to and including the brain. And a lot of people talk about the brain and us coming back. Well, yeah, but you've got to do smaller things first. Also, for space travel, many people see in science fiction movies somebody frozen essentially in time. Well, the reason for that is because space and time are relative, right? And in order for you to travel to a far distant galaxy, you would age biologically to a point where you would die before you ever got there and covered that distance. But if you could stop metabolic processes, which is what the process does, and you could conceivably be revived when you get there and be the same young, youthful person you were when you started. And that's the goal.
How cool is that? I think science is progressing, technology is progressing, and I think we need to handhold technology rather than cry wolf and say that technology is going to be existential threat, because that's that there's a large group of people which has that kind of narrative out. So yes, I think great things. I mean, eventually I think we will need to kind of move out of this planet and look at another planet, and these space travel could mean like possibly hundreds of years, and maybe this technology could play a huge role in getting us to another safer planet, safer home, besides Earth. Now, you spoke about organs. Now, the organ transplant at this point in time is definitely a problem, because once the organ is out of the body, it decays rapidly, and these heart or lung they last largely for around 4 or 6 hours, and for a liver or a kidney, I think it's about liver is about 8 to 12 hours, and a kidney is about 1 to 2 days max, and so we don't even have an organ preservation technology at this point of time. Do you think that the science behind cryonics could play a role in enabling this organ preservation? Because that is a genuine problem.
Well, Eddie, you raised a couple of good points. I think the first one is, and I want to address it, is the notion that there are people who feel that new technologies or emerging technologies could pose an existential threat. Now, I literally teach at some of the top universities as a guest lecturer about emerging technologies. And one of the things I emphasize to people, if you take emotion out of it and you just look at things very logically, even artificial intelligence, which of course is the new next threat. Well, at one point, there's actually historical footage that the automobile was going to kill everybody. Okay. So, that was the emerging technology in the early 1900s, and then it was the planes, and then it was this or that. And the simple reality is that human beings control all this stuff. And technology in and of itself is neither good nor evil. The application, how it's used, determines the effect. And so ultimately, the technology itself is not an existential threat. If people misuse technology, it can become an existential threat. So that's an important point. And I think with regards to the organ banking, you asked, well, how likely is it that that can be done? Well, I think we have to address an underlying issue, which is why hasn't it already been done? Scientifically, it's possible probably today, meaning there are enough what we call complementary technologies. So that's a term I coined when I teach on this. So there's aspirational technologies, complementary technologies, and emerging technologies. Okay. So for instance, the electric car, the Tesla, it wouldn't exist on a broad scale and be usable without the complementary battery technology. Okay. So with regards to cryonics and organ transplantation and organ banking, the complementary technology, I believe, exists today. So why aren't we doing it? Well, the frank answer, and probably the most honest answer, is that in Western countries, at least, and I don't know the legal system, I'm trained as an attorney and I do technology law, but in Western countries, at least, you cannot sell or buy an organ for profit. So there is no profit incentive to solve this problem. That means all of the billions of dollars that go into medical research are typically going into things like drugs or devices that can be sold for a very high profit margin. There's no money in doing this. That's why we are a nonprofit. Alcor is a nonprofit. And I can tell you that the science is very close, meaning it's so close that I can see it. And it's been done on a small scale, mammalian scale. So it has to be scaled up. And if you gave us, if we had the resources today, I think it could be done in a year, 2 years, because I've seen the science that's not public. But it's really a question of resources applied. That's what it is. And I think we know from certain wealthy people that are contributing, for instance, to Alcor, that when we get those influxes of money, that leaps the science forward again and again. But it comes in kind of fits and starts, right? And again, these people are donating money, so there's no return. They're not stockholders or shareholders, so they're just doing it to advance the science. But when you get it in kind of fits and starts, you make 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I can almost assure you that if this were a for-profit model, organ banking would be possible already. The complementary science is there.
Right, right. You mentioned that you're an attorney and you look at tech law. How do you think law is going to pan out in this dynamic world where tech is converging, because earlier it used to be like a single tech, I mean, an artificial intelligence gone through several winters, and now these LLMs have kind of bought it at the forefront. But then, there are these lot of other plays happening, because there is AR, VR, MR, there is nanotech, there is robotics, and there's Web 3.0, and these are all converging. And when they're all converging, they are, I wouldn't say that getting out of hand, but I think law itself has to be kind of redefined. So maybe share your thoughts on how law is going to pan out, in this dynamic world, and also address, because you mentioned about tech being an existential threat, the narrative, So especially for someone who's in the field of cryonics, the religion society looks down upon something. It's kind of like blacklisted, So I'm vested in metaverse, and it's not the similar, but there are a lot of people who think that why do we need a technology like AR VR? Why should we um, confine them into these technologies and stuff like that? So but I think when it comes to cryonics, it's another level. The religion society is pretty much against augmenting human or revival of humans. So I have done my part of creating education, creating awareness, from 2016 to making people aware about this technology. So technology and law, how is that going to pan out? And B, what is Alcor doing to create awareness and a different narrative for cryonics?
Okay, so technology and law, great question. The way the interplay typically exists with technology and law is that law is a very slow moving process, almost by design, because you don't want to create absolute rules for people on a little bit of information. You want to have years or decades of a history to kind of shape your law. Okay. The problem with that is when you have technologies that are moving at exponentially faster rates than the law is moving, that's where you get society trying to play catch up. So you can have technologies that are actually make the world safer, like, for instance, cars that are self-driving. They're actually logically, take all the emotion out of it, but just logically, self-driving cars are far safer than human-driven cars. Human error is the number one cause of accidents. And you'll see some animals behind me, but I have some interesting animals. That comes into play because we're trying to do some things with rescuing endangered species and being able to freeze animals that are endangered. So Alcor's got a role in that too. But in any event, so with regards to law and emerging technologies, one of the challenges I have, because I actually talk at law schools about emerging technology specifically, and there's always the question of, oh, is this going to hurt more people than it helps? Well, because the law is designed to ultimately try and protect people from harm, right? Hopefully. And what inevitably happens is you kind of have this arc where at first emerging technologies are scary and there's resistance because people push a narrative that it's a threat. And if you step back, and lawyers are supposed to be trained to be very logical, so we're supposed to be hired to take emotion out of tense situations and create a resolution. That's what we do. Well, if you step back and say, if I take all emotion away from this emerging technology, let's just look at facts, right? And if you look at cryonics in that context, the facts are, if you can do this, you will save at least 200 lives a day of people who don't need to die simply because they don't have an extra 6 or 12 hours to get an organ, or they can't match the organ. And if you could get weeks, you don't even need months. If you could get 4 weeks, you could do basically perfect matches. Why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we? It's not a hard, it's hard, but it's not, it's a matter of resources applied. That's all it is. And management of those resources, of course. So that's what my job is now at Alcor. It's to manage resources to help achieve that goal. All right, so that's one thing. The other question you referenced was culture, but you said religion, but I actually broadened that, okay? Because whether you're this religion or that religion, there's also just cultural things where it might be people's custom, for instance, to do things a certain way, and they might resist what we're trying to do. But I like to define my terms as a lawyer, and I like to say, okay, if you believe in a religion, pick one. It could be anyone. It could be monotheistic or polytheistic. You could believe in a lot of gods or one God. But ultimately, you believe in a God, a higher power. Okay? I think most religions, have that as a floor, kind of a baseline. So let's talk about that. If you believe in a higher power, well, presumably, and I've looked at a lot of world religions, I've actually kind of studied some of those, and they believe ultimately that the higher power, whoever that is all-knowing, all-powerful, omniscient in some manner or another. Or if you believe in a polytheistic religion, you believe that each God has some component of all powerfulness or powerfulness in a space, right? But nonetheless, by definition, if God is God, if your God is all-knowing and all-powerful, or whichever God you relate to is powerful in their space, the simple reality is, if that is true, then by definition, if that God doesn't want this to happen and be successful, it never will be. By your own definition, they're in charge. So you have nothing to worry about. And all it does is it advances the science of other things in the process, right? So that is something I try and really emphasize with people, is this notion that if you're scared that this is going to happen and alter religion or anything else, then you're actually weakening your own God. You're weakening the definition of your own God. And I'm pretty sure that's not supposed to happen, right? So don't worry about it, because listen, we know heart transplants are possible today. And there was a time where there was a big cultural push against transplantation. In the early 1950s and 1940s, 1950s, there was culture and religious objections to transplants or blood transfusions. And some religions today even have a problem with that. But the simple reality, take all emotion away from it. The simple reality is God, whoever your God is, has allowed blood transfusions, heart transplants to occur. We know because it occurs every day. So, if this is meant to work, it'll work. If it's not meant to work, there's no amount of human energy and effort that will make it work and trump God. That's why I don't worry about it. But I know that there's a lot of advances that will save people's lives. And I do believe, my beliefs are that if there's a higher power, that higher power wants good in life, and what we're doing would help people live. And so I tend to think that if there's a God, that God generally would want people to live and have healthy lives, right? Hopefully. And so that's what we're trying to achieve.
Right. So more power to you, James, and your team. And you rightfully pointed out there was push against organ transplant, IVF, and so on and so forth. But today, I think healthcare, we just cannot do without it. There are millions of people around the world who are regularly going through these transplants, and there are millions of IVF children. In fact, I think in India, there was the second scientist in the world. The second IVF baby was done by an Indian scientist somewhere in Calcutta, and the guy was completely pushed to the edge because the entire society and culture didn't want that to happen. He had to commit suicide. So yes, that's quite terrible. So I think we should completely enable and empower scientists, researchers, and technologies, because we humans are constantly evolving, and this evolution, we have to handhold technology, because that's been a constant, right from the fire to today, these various simple tech like a phone, and, then maybe an AI and so on and so forth. So I think we need to constantly handhold, yes, but I think we need to be cognizant that these technologies are now becoming self-learning, and obviously we need to be building these technologies which have the betterment of humanity in mind. I think humans will collectively progress. Alcor Life Foundation. Would you like to talk about this? And you mentioned that given a year's time, you will be able to kind of advance cryonics. So what does that mean about there's around, I think, close to 300 odd customers who have already been cryopreserved. Have they been cryopreserved in a wrong method?
We have over 200 people that we call them patients, okay? Because if we do what we're doing right, someday perhaps some portion of them will be alive again, right? That's a possibility. I didn't say it's a probability. I think the technology now is still very new. But nonetheless, we treat all of our members who, when they die, become patients. In fact, we have a deployment almost being called today. So I've been very busy. But we have teams that go anywhere in the world and collect our members who are dying. And we try to get to them right after death, because that is where we can perfuse the body. We actually wash out the blood and we perfuse the body with a solution that allows your cells to survive ultra cold temperatures. But the bacteria and things that would cause decay can't survive those ultra cold temperatures. So it's just protecting your cells. Those bodies are then taken, and there's a long, about a 5-day process called a cool down process to prevent as much damage as possible, where we cool the cells down, and then they go into a permanent storage in what's called a dewar, which is DEWAR, and it looks like a giant thermos, and it contains the bodies of our patients at negative 320 degrees Fahrenheit, which I believe is about 140 Celsius. And then, we protect them in the patient care bay. And what I do want to say is we have thousands, 1,500 plus members, plus associate members all over the world. And there's very few people who know all of our members, who they are, because we have a confidential group of members. And I am one of the few people who know who those people are. And we have the leading scientists, the leading technology people in the entire world that have changed history singularly. Many of them are members. And part of it for me, when I took this job, so I've just been in the job about a year, and I was Alcor's attorney, but I represented other technology companies. But one of the things that really struck me as their attorney was I was seeing the quality and level of the scientists and the technology people that were involved behind the scenes, the stuff that's not public. And I was just floored. I had never seen an organization that had this diverse group of people from all over the world, unquestionably some of the smartest people that are alive, that all, from different walks of life. We had people from different religions, different countries, different cultures, but they all were coming together to achieve this goal. Now, maybe not publicly, because they have to worry about their cultural situation or other things that I don't even think about, I didn't even know about. And yet privately, they kind of feel like, hey, this is a real possibility. And when you have some of the smartest people on earth, jointly from different positions and perspectives saying this is possible, well, I would be a fool not to listen, right? And then I was like, whoa, what is this about? And then I started understanding just logically. I mean, we know logically if you get cremated, and cremation is very morbid. People talk about what we do as being morbid, but I'm like, cremation's awful. You burn, it's really hard to watch. I've never liked worms, so the notion of getting buried and eaten by worms was very unpleasant to me my whole life, right? Before I knew about this third option. So at the very worst, this is just an internment. It's a above ground burial, as it were. And that's the worst case. But if there's a 0.0001% chance that this retains my memory, and think about, Eddie, I don't know all your background, but think about the amount of memories and experiences that your brain alone contains that can never be replicated because those moments in time are gone. But your brain is a hard drive. And if you had a computer and the fan on your computer went out, would you throw away the whole computer? No, because you have so much value in that hard drive. But the hard drive won't work without the power in the fan. What do? You take the hard drive out and you put it in a new case, or you plug a new part into it, right? And you get all your files back. That's it. Your heart is like your power center. So if I have a heart attack, does that mean I ought to just say, well, this is just gone and, so sad? Well, you wouldn't do it for a computer. Why would you do it for your brain? So all of these smart people on a very logic, non-emotional, non-cultural, non-religious basis look at it like, well, if it's a 0.001% chance, and the cost to do it is actually fairly minimal. And a lot of people criticize the cost and they don't understand how it works. But in reality, most people, including myself, we don't have $200,000 to pay to do this, which is the whole body. You can just do your head, your brain, which is about $90,000. But most people don't have that kind of money lying around. So frankly, most of us just use life insurance to pay for this. And life insurance is a monthly cost of $100 or whatever it is in your country. And, when you die, that money gets used to pay for the preservation. And then Alcor gets to do all the research related to that. So that's the trade-off. And we're a nonprofit, so it's not going into my pocket. I actually make a lot of my personal income from other businesses. Okay. I do this because I'm privy as an attorney to the confidential, non-public information that is just, it's outstanding. And Eddie, I know that India has a really strong culture for math and sciences. and is really, I think, in many ways, a leader in the world in some of those areas. For instance, vaccine development and production and things like that in the biomedical sciences. And there are people from all over the world that could contribute to this and that could move the ball forward. And what your culture is or anything else doesn't matter. It's a universal thing. So I really enjoy that aspect of the job is getting to talk to people like you and participate with different cultures to find a common goal with really smart people. Like, if my brain never comes back, doesn't matter, because I'm in there next to, the guy on my left changed the world and the woman on my right changed the world. And then there's little old me. I just think that's super cool. Whatever. That's the worst case. So that's kind of how I view this whole process.
Right. You mentioned that you have lots of members and a lot of people who are at the front movers, the cutting edge of science and technology. What's Alcor doing? With the R&D, to push the field of cryonics research forward.
Well, there's multiple things that Alcor is currently engaged in achieving. Now, all of these things require money, right? I have staff and I have outside people I have to pay. So what we do is I'm actually out there. I think I reached 200,000 miles on my frequent traveler program this year. So I have been all over the country and some other parts of the world, meeting with people to raise funds for projects like, I have to be careful because some of it is not public yet. So I have to think about what I can tell you about. But there are certainly things that would help stabilize cells and prevent ice formation. So there's biochemistry involved. There's biochemistry projects. When you said research and design, that involves things like what we call a liquid nitrogen transport. So let's say that, Eddie, you died in India, but there's no place to store you in India or convenient, right? Well, we have to get you to liquid nitrogen temperature very quickly. How do we do that and then transport you? Because liquid nitrogen is a gas, and if you put it on a plane, that could be a problem. You have to do it a very specific way, and you have to, have designers and engineers. We actually have an engineer in-house, and they're constantly improving these processes or the actual units themselves. And then in addition to that, we are contracted with outside biochemists. We talk to medical doctors. I've talked to transplant teams. So there's, a number of fantastic Indian doctors out there. And in fact, I met with one recently, a preeminent Indian doctor, which was nice because I love Indian food. So we went and had some good food. But in any event, these people are just world-class medical doctors, scientists. Specifically what we're doing, we're working on the real hard science components, which is an interplay between mechanical engineering, thermodynamics, biology, biochemistry, right? It touches on a lot of things, and then medicine, ultimately. Because this would just be a continuation of medicine. If we could, for instance, Eddie, there's a project we're working on, and I can't get into specifics on it, but let's say you were a soldier and you stepped on a landmine and, half your leg was blown off. What if we could put you in a box, hit a button, and have your entire metabolic processes slowed way, way, way down? So you weren't going into shock, you weren't bleeding out, and then you could be transported to a field hospital. But the same applies in an auto accident or anything else. If there was a device where you could be put in there and just hit a button and kind of pauses all the trauma, that enlarges the golden hour of trauma. We could do 3, 4, 5 hours. Well, your survival rates would be exponentially better. Okay. Now that's a lot of hard science. That's engineers, and then that's doctors, and they all have to work together, and there's costs. So, but those are actively things that Alcor cares about. At the end of the day, it's called the Alcor Life Extension. So we care about extending lives, saving lives. And that's what we're doing every day. And we have some really cool projects. We are open. Part of our lab is open to the public in the sense that people can schedule a tour. It's secure, but you can sign up and take a tour. And I think that really shows people that we're a laboratory and we're doing hard science. There's, the internet, there's a lot of things and people say a lot of stuff. And frankly, most of it doesn't really apply. When you come to Alcor and you see scientists and designers working on things, it makes a lot more sense.
Right. Now, I think that would be excellent. I mean, these injury patients, I mean, if you could pause the trauma, I think that would be really excellent. You spoke about, I mean, possible, like, I mean, a patient from India. Is this specifically for America, or do you address patients around the world? And if you do, what's the process? If somebody is like dying a specific time, what's the timelines that it's required for you to kind of reach the patient? How does it work?
Well, we do have members throughout the world. And some parts of the world, of course, are much easier to get to than others. We strongly recommend, if you know you're dying, your best option is to come to Arizona and be near our headquarters in hospice. Okay? But we also know that many people don't want to do that, and they want to die at home, or they want to die, in their hometown. So we have what are called DART teams. And DART, D-A-R-T, stands for Deployment and Recovery Team. So DART. So we get a phone call. In fact, we're on a watch right now. So that's what I've been busy with today. But we have word of a member who is gone into the hospital. And, our team is prepared within 2 hours to go anywhere in the world. So they have specialized medical kits, very specialized gear that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. So they can't go get it. They have to bring it with them. And they will go 2 hours, and however long it takes to get to wherever they need to go, they will go. And they consist of first responders and retired special forces military. And people say, well, why them? Well, because they're the best at going places on short notice, and they make sure they have their kits ready. They're highly organized. They're very good at logistics. They can move heavy things, and so the nurses, of course, have the medical expertise, and they're all trained. So we have a special training program. They have to go through and pass all these tests. They have to qualify. Okay. This is on top of having already qualified for their profession or for special forces. And then they come to work for us. And we have them located throughout the United States primarily, but they will be international soon. And they are qualified to pretty much go in and get your body. Now, the hardest part sometimes is the local governments, because sometimes governments have certain requirements, and so those are challenges. But for the most part, our team has been very, very good. In fact, last year, we had a team off the coast of Africa and another team at the same time in Hawaii. So we were kind of amazed at how we were able to field these two teams that were on literal opposite sides of the globe on the earth at the same time, recovering bodies. So, that's what we do. Now, as we grow, obviously that'll have to get more robust. So we're adding people. We have a reserve list now of people who are interested that haven't yet qualified on the training, but we do background checks and do all these things on people. But the ideal circumstance is that we have notice that you're ill or that you might die, and then that we get to you with our equipment a few hours before you die. And if we're bedside and we can access your body, then the whole process starts within 10 minutes, if not less, ideally. That's the ideal. Now, many times we can't, be bedside. And so we have to wait for the body to be released, but it depends on your circulatory system. So your circulatory system will stay, alive and stay robust for an hour, 2 hours. And if it's robust, then we can perfuse all the chemicals through your body. If it's not, then that makes it a lot more difficult. So 3 or 4 hours after death, it's a lot more difficult. And we may have to do a different procedure where we just go in through the carotid and put the fluids through your brain to really ensure your brain is preserved. So it depends on the circumstances, but ideally just think of time to temperature. That's the important thing. So the sooner we can get to you after death, we keep your circulatory system going. We actually do CPR. And people say, well, why are you doing CPR on a dead person? Oh, because we're actually trying to keep your blood pushing the veins open and keeping all your capillaries and your veins and your arteries open. because that then allows us to have our chemical, which is more viscous than blood, so it's thicker than blood at certain temperatures, right? Because we know as things cool, they turn to ice, or they get cold, they move slower. Those are all thermodynamic biochemical engineering issues, extremely complex. So if there's smart people listening to this, we're always open to talking to more smart people, because this is probably some of the most complex biomedical engineering on Earth. But that's what we do. So we get your body, and frankly, our crew, we did 23 recoveries last year. So we're averaging two bodies a month right now. And then when we get them back to Alcor, we do a variety of research tests. We do a CT scan if we can. So we want to see how your brain is preserved. We can look at brains. We have a brain that was born in the 1880s. We have a brain from somebody born in 2010. So we have over 100 years, and we can look at environmental differences, volume differences. Brains change with the environment. So there's lots of things we can do with that research. And then we take those bodies, and it's about a 4 or 5 day cool down process. And then it goes for permanent resting in a dewar. And we identify everybody with what's called an A number. So when you go in the dewar, your name, you don't have a name tag per se, because everybody's equal in death, right? You might have been a billionaire when you were alive, but when you go in the dewar, you're just with everybody else, and you have an anonymous number, because we do have some incredibly well-known people, and we don't want people coming in and trying to, mess with them or anything else. So it's just easier to do it this way. And then hopefully, they're protected indefinitely. It's not reliant on power. So a lot of people say, well, what happens if the power goes out? Doesn't matter for what we do. We don't use electricity to power the cool down process. You couldn't get it cold enough. So it's a chemical process, and the chemicals that we use, they're good for an extended length of time. I won't get into specifics, but we can maintain those bodies for a good length of time. And presuming there's not something that just wipes out the entire country, we can pretty much do this indefinitely.
Right.
So Alcor's been around 50 years already. So we're not going anywhere.
Right. No, cool. So your business has got like multi-pronged problems, right? From retrieving of the body at, certain course of time, then comes the next step of cryopreservation, which is also a technology, which is, it's in early stages. Then obviously the last and the most difficult challenge, which is the revival part, and so in the space of, cryopreservation, you spoke about cryopreservation. What does the revival look like? Do we have an inkling of what could be the technology, and is there any proof of concept or something that's been done in the scientific community where they brought maybe basic organisms or something to life? Because I think I'd read an article where the Japan's National Institute Polar Research, which had revived a tardigrade, which was cryopreserved for a minus 20 degrees Celsius in 1983, and I think it was unfrozen back in 2014 after 30 years, and it lived successfully. So is there any POC done or something that, in space of maybe animals which was cryopreserved and brought back to life?
The question is, is there any evidence that animals could be frozen or what we call vitrified for any substantial length of time and brought back? And I think we are seeing evidence of that. You mentioned the tardigrades that the Japanese did, but we've also found worms that have been in the frozen tundra that may have existed for tens of thousands of years, right? These are very simple celled organisms. We know that. But there have been examples of, take an easy one, like a bear goes into hibernation for a period of time, doesn't eat, doesn't drink, doesn't do anything, right? Again, much warmer temperatures than what we're talking about. There have been some mammalian organs. So there was a recent study out of the University of Minnesota. There's some studies from 2007 that mammalian organs, small ones, were vitrified, so meaning frozen at an ultra cold temperature, and survived enough to be functional. So that's proof of concept. Now, again, the hardest challenge in what we're doing is scale. You can talk about everything else, but there's proof of concept that it can absolutely be done. There are small organisms that it's been done in, the worms and the tardigrades. So it's not antithetical to life that it can be done. That's proof of concept. The problem is when you start stacking cellular structures together and becoming a complex, large organ or mammal or human, then those are degrees of scale, right? It's exponentially more difficult because you have more layers to kind of defrost and revive. But there's absolutely clear scientific evidence that it should ultimately be possible. And let me put it a different way. There's nothing that says it can't be done. And there are things that have been done on the small scale that absolutely can be done. So now it's a question of scalability up. Yes, it can be done. And I think there's good evidence that it can be done, but it will take time.
Right. You mentioned about hibernation. Are there, these bears, hibernate for a long time. Then there's the wood frog. It seems like, it can freeze for months and then it can spring back to life. So is there any learnings from there which can be taken, possibly used in the R&D?
Well, Eddie, you make a great point, which is, so for instance, the wood frogs, actually, some of the solutions that are being used for human cell preservation actually are derived from animal proteins. Meaning these are animals such as fish that they might freeze in a lake, and by all accounts, they're I guess dead. There's no activity, right? But then the lake thaws and these fish are revived. Well, those fish have a certain structure or protein in their blood, in their cells, that allows them to survive that freezing process without their cells getting destroyed. So those are some of the science and research issues that Alcor looks at very much so. So you just mimic from nature and then you try to scale it up. And so we are in the midst of taking some of those animal things and looking at their application to human cells and human biology. So yeah, that's a great point.
Right. So you do you cryogenically freeze body, head, and pets. What's the plan of action for revival? When you, what's more simpler? When you do head freezing cryogenically, is it like you're planning to revive it and possibly would there be like a full body transplant, or would it be like brain upload into the virtual world metaverse? What's the plan? What's the idea? Inkling over there.
Well, we could spend days on what they call revival technologies, right? Or revival philosophies. So there are people who believe that we will kind of become robotic or computer oriented. There are people who believe that we'll take the brain and have a cloned body of our own cells. And just to be clear, Alcor is not necessarily, the goal is revival. Yes, that's the goal, but it's going to be billions and billions of dollars to implement revival technologies. Now, that being said, we're starting to see some of the world's billionaires that have an interest in space travel, for instance. Right? They realize that this has to be achieved to do space travel. So if you look, many of those same billionaires are actually invested in companies that touch upon the brain revival process. People have heard of Neuralink. People have heard of Jeff Bezos has a company. So there are very wealthy people out there, that have much more resources than Alcor that are focused on this potential. And the potential is really, if you say brain, the brain by itself doesn't have any interface. It's, again, use the hard drive analogy. A hard drive is only useful to Eddie if Eddie has a mouse and a screen, right? Well, your brain's only useful if you have eyes and ears and a nose and a way to communicate, right? So we're looking and seeing that these companies and billionaires are developing technologies that interact with the brain directly and give the brain a means to interact with the world outside of it through sensors and things. So it's entirely possible that some of those revival technologies, and I know there's interest because I've sat with some billionaires, it's entirely possible that their technologies will kind of coalesce with Alcor. And frankly, a brain's no good unless it's well preserved. Well, Alcor is the best in the world at preserving the brains. We've got a 50-year history of research and doing it. So they need us, and we're going to likely need their resources. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship at some point, and that's where I see this going. But do I have a personal opinion on whether it's going to be a robot body or a cloned body? I don't know. I will tell you that technically, medically, a head transplant's essentially possible today. So if you had a massive heart attack and you could actually get the head and keep the brain oxygenated long enough, vascular surgeons can connect your carotids. That's not the problem. Even your muscles can kind of regrow and stuff. The problem is your spinal cord. Okay? So you can't connect the spinal cord, and it would be unethical to transplant your head onto a body that didn't function, right? So that's why, frankly, those things aren't done. But with regards to could it be done? Well, there's a lot of stuff we can do today, and then there's a lot of other people working on the complementary technologies. My goal at Alcor is to give them the materials to work with. I want to make sure we've preserved the body and the brain and the cells in as good a state as is possible. Now, there's something else you mentioned, you touched on really early, which was nanotech. Well, nanotech, what that means in the cryonics world, that's actually interesting you brought that up. There are some substantial developments that are non-public, okay? So there are companies that are kind of secretive, and they're working very hard at developing molecular or nano robots or nano, viruses, for instance, or things that can actually work throughout the body and travel through the body and repair cells, okay? And that's a very minute process, atomic level, molecular level process. But that nanotech will probably play a role in all of this. And I don't know the form, but it's most likely an engineered type of, for lack of a better term, robot. But it's something that would be able to go through and identify damage and help repair that cellular damage from the vitrification process. Ideally, if we do our job and keep developing the state of the art, there'll be less damage to repair someday. Now, if I can give you a brain that's not damaged, there's no reason a company, I'm not saying Neuralink, but a company like Neuralink, they can already measure the electric impulses and have you control something, right? Well, if you have the brain, there's no reason that wouldn't otherwise be possible.
Right.
Now, people see that cartoon, there's a cartoon called Futurama, and there's a head kind of in a jar, and it moves around and whatever. I don't know that people would want to do that, but some of the computer scientists think that if your brain were connected to an avatar in the metaverse, that maybe that would be a functional equivalent for you. I don't know. Frankly, I'm not that smart. I'm trying to get a result and apply what we do have to get that result, and we're pretty damn close. It's very exciting, and I'm pleased to be working on such a cutting edge project. Let's put it that way.
Right. We wish you the very best. And I guess, all of these converging technologies are going to come together, and the future looks very, very exciting, right? From nanotech, nanorobotics to, I had the privilege of also interviewing Sergio Canavero, who's the forefront of head transplant, So yes, I think exciting things, some really exciting, some really scary. My last question to you, since you mentioned in the course of the conversation with Alcor's foundation, you have some of the top scientists, some top technologists who've been working for you. So could you share a prediction? What do you think the future looks like when all of these tech, science and tech is converging, and also maybe share the future of Alcor's. What's the future possibilities that you envision for cryonics?
Well, and I have a guest here. This is Daisy. I introduce you to Daisy because one of the things that has to do with the future tech of Alcor is really preservation of rare animals. So I have a lot of animals here. We can actually, if you have that Sumatran tiger that's going extinct, we could probably preserve enough of that animal to give future scientists a way to revive those animals or genetically recreate those animals. So there's a lot of value in that. That's certainly something that Alcor has a great interest in doing. We are the best in the world at preserving large biological specimens using ultra cold temperatures. So that's a natural fit. The future for Alcor hopefully is really bright. I mean, if I do my job well, and we do have some announcements towards the end of this year that, assuming all goes well, some of those world-class scientists will be more public, which again, in the past, there, like you said, the scientific culture kind of looked at cryonics as being this outlier and this kind of science fiction-y that they didn't want to be associated with. Well, that's changing. I'm working very hard to kind of change the culture, move away from some of the stuff on the extreme and move more to what can we do today in the hard science. So that's a big part of my personal goals at Alcor. I also want to get kidneys and organ banking. I want to advance that science. We're working very hard with some very reputable universities, world-class universities, that we're using that expertise to kind of move that forward. And now, again, the brain is the aspirational goal someday down the road, but I want to get those incremental wins. I want to get those smaller things. And because I think sometimes when you overreach and you look too far, you miss what's right in front of you. And I'm very much somebody that's like, okay, how do you eat the elephant? Well, if I told you I'm just going to go swallow the elephant whole, I wouldn't be credible, right? No, I'm going to eat the elephant one little bite at a time. And it's going to take me a year, but I'll eat that elephant, right? And that's kind of how I view these sorts of projects. I want to take it one bite at a time. And then you get more credible. And when you get more credible, guess what? The world-class scientists say, maybe I can lend to that credibility by now being public. So I'm very, very excited if I can pull it off. We're already in conversations with several people who have singularly forever changed the world. And they are more open to having a public association with Alcor, hopefully by the end of this year. And if in fact that comes to fruition, I think we're going to shock the world a little bit with the level of science that we're putting forward at this point. Now, these are all sensitive conversations and things, and they take a lot of nuance, but I'm putting in the legwork this year to do that. So I wish I could tell you more, because it's, I'm so eager for it to happen, but I feel very positive that those developments will occur. So anybody who has an interest, they should kind of like keep an ear out. Maybe we have another interview in a year from now, and a year from now, we may have some very serious people that are publicly involved with this that, can change everything singularly.
Lovely. James, really, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. Really appreciate the way you kind of explain cryogenics. And I guess you rightfully pointed out one step at a time, because I think we are seeing the far out opportunity, but there are so many opportunities which can be the problems that can be sorted right now, and yes, I mean kudos to you and your team for doing it for the last 50 years and single-handedly fronting it. Like you mentioned, you need there are single people in the world who are brave enough and who go make the changes. You don't need a team. It's just that single human being that always possibly makes the difference. So more power to you, and I hope that next year we get to hear those breakthrough people, billionaires, change makers who are joining the organization, and more power to you that we come to a point where we first come to the step where we can cryopreserve an organ, then maybe the body, then the head, and then pets, and so on and so forth. So more power to you, and to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye bye. Thank you. Really appreciate this.
Take a tour.